Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. I'm super stoked because today, as part of my poetry series, I am going to talk about The Tempest by William Shakespeare, which is included in the complete works of William Shakespeare. I'm really excited to talk about The Tempest and what I learned from reading The Tempest and watching the on-screen adaptation of the play. And I'm really excited to talk about the poetry that is William Shakespeare, and that is The Tempest. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I wanted to focus on the poetry of William Shakespeare's The Tempest, and there's a way in which I want to do that by drawing attention to two elements of the play and of the poetry itself in the play. And that involves the idea of performance as well as the idea of stream of consciousness. So let me first break down performance. William Shakespeare's play is very interesting because, like many of his works of drama, he has characters who are very dramatic, dramaturgical, emotional, involved, very engaging, very interested in the presentation. And I think what's very interesting about Shakespeare as a poet is that his poetry comes out in the performances of the actors themselves, not just from the words themselves. And so this is very interesting because it does contrast with someone like Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, which is very much, you could describe this book-length poem, which, while you definitely can read aloud and might gain a lot more from the Middle English language by reading it out loud, you can definitely also read like a narrative, like a story. And so it's definitely interesting to think that by the time you get to Shakespeare in the Renaissance, you have someone who's creating characters and poetry that needs that acting out and performance in order for the meaning to get across. Now, I've realized that, such as by watching the adaptation, that there is a marked difference between reading the play by Shakespeare and watching the play. And I noticed that the emotion of the words themselves get across a lot more when you actually hear it out loud versus when you're reading it. Now, this, of course, doesn't mean that you can't get a lot of benefit from reading the play in the same way that you would get a lot of benefit from reading the Canterbury Tales. But the idea is that you also get this extra dimension by listening to it and by listening to various things, including the language, the rhythm, the emotion, the inflection, all of those things, which creates the impact that is the play itself and the poetry in the play, the poetry that these characters speak. And so it is very interesting because this is actually an element of poetry that I think Shakespeare definitely dramatizes and brings out, which is that of performance. Often when we think of poetry, we do think of books. We think of being alone in our apartment or home and drinking coffee and reading a poem or two by a poet. But Shakespeare is very interesting because performance is also a part of the dynamic. And I do think that, like I said, while you can read the poems themselves, the poetry itself by way of the play, and by reading it, you definitely get an added dimension through the performance of the acting of the actors and of what is conveyed through the acting itself, through that performance. Now, the other thing that's interesting about poetry in Shakespeare, specifically The Tempest, is that you have these characters who are very much focused on this evolution of thought, and stream of consciousness is an idea that developed in modernist circles and in the modernist movement of writing and literature and art. But I would still say that one of the interesting things about this style is that it very much doesn't seek to organize thought. And so when you read Shakespeare, you're almost reading something that feels like almost a direct imprint of someone's actual way of thinking. And so that's why I use the word stream of consciousness. It's not necessarily because it is the exact description of what he's doing, but I think it's helpful for looking at it in terms of looking at thoughts that are less organized, less logical, more poetic, as in this case. And I think that that's what makes the monologues and the speech of these characters so fascinating, is that the language is very dense and involved, but also very poetic and beautiful, and it conveys the thought process of the characters. I think not even just the Tempest, when looking at these characters, but also plays like King Lear, you get this degree of emotion involved whenever you are listening to or reading the stream of consciousness idea and approach, and whenever you feel it. And I think that that's actually very interesting for poetry to do, because it captures this thought process that these characters are having. And I think that that's a remarkable idea. Now, the reason why I like The Tempest as a play and as a work of art is because of the characters, such as Prospero and Miranda, who is Prospero's daughter, who are very interesting characters, very full of life. And Prospero is a character, without spoiling the plot, who has this very interesting redemptive arc. And so, this isn't a spoiler, but for instance, Prospero is exiled and finds himself to be alone and isolated. And so what he's trying to do is figure out how to gain back all that he's lost. And so the play really is remarkable for capturing this character who has this ability for literal magic. He can literally perform magic to achieve the outcome that he wants. And he's able to do this. But as the play goes along and his plan moves forward, you start to realize that he's actually not a bad person at all. And even though you might argue that using magic might be a very dark thing to do to try to get your way, you start to sympathize with the reasons for what Prospero is doing, using magic as a way of reincorporating his old life. And I really like the redemptive arc of this character, and I think that Prospero is definitely one of Shakespeare's more interesting characters, because he definitely has this clear narrative arc, and he definitely has his own creativity about him. And one of the things that I think about whenever I'm listening to Prospero's poetry is that he very much goes on these very lengthy monologues, and I think a monologue is an underappreciated element of poetry that I think is important to keep in mind. So a monologue, as you may know, is an acted piece, usually, that is from a person's thoughts and that are conveyed in words and sometimes through acting, usually through acting, but it just depends on what the context is. But it's very interesting because Shakespeare does implement and employ a lot of monologues. And it's very interesting because when you compare it to movie making today, where with a lot of movies, the dialogue is usually clipped in order to capture this very concise feel. And even though there are a lot of very talented movies and shows where they use monologues very skillfully, monologues aren't always thought of as this means for capturing poetry in the modern world. And I think they might even be removed or excluded from film because they are too lengthy and complex. But one of the things that makes Shakespeare an original is the way that he used monologues. He uses monologues in such a way to where it captures this deep inner sense of poetry, and I think it captures this beauty that otherwise might be missed were he not using the monologue. And so I just think it's important to keep in mind that the monologue is such a rich way of capturing language and emotion, and I think The Tempest is a perfect example of a play that captures all of that. And I think that it is definitely well done. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when you are reading and writing poetry is to think of language. And when I read Shakespeare's language, such as in The Tempest, but also perhaps in plays like King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, or Hamlet, you definitely realize that Shakespeare is employing what you could call his own tongue, his own words, his own ideas, his own language. And I think it's fascinating. Now, it is true that his diction was different from the modern era, from contemporary settings, because he was in the Renaissance. He was in Renaissance England. And so their language was different from the way that it's spoken and written today. So I do think that's part of the reason why his language is so unique. But I also want to say that Shakespeare is interesting as far as language because he really does employ, for example, through monologues and through the performance of his pieces, where he captures his own sense of language. He captures his own idiom, so to speak, where language is his, where language is subjectively his. And I think that that's such a fascinating thing for an artist to do, because I think if poets are able to capture that beauty of language, I think it's amazing what they're able to convey through their own words and through their own way of writing and thinking and through the way in which they use language, which often can be very unique. Now, I do think that a lot of artists and writers do this, where they have their own language. And I do think that it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of different writers use language in different ways. But the reason why I want to highlight language with Shakespeare specifically as being his own language is because I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's part of authenticity, is the way that you write and speak, the way that you convey poetry. And I think that that's what Shakespeare does in a way that is very unique. And I think he can capture it in a way in poetry that you can't necessarily capture through prose or narrative form. And I actually really like that idea because I think it opens up and expands what Shakespeare is doing, and I think it creates a lot more meaning. Shakespeare is indeed adding a lot of metaphor, he's adding a lot of allegory, he's adding a lot of layers to his written words, and I think that's what adds to what he's doing, and I think that's what makes his language his own. And so I think this is what a lot of the great poets are able to do, in my opinion, is be able to share their own language and the way that they use language in a unique and authentic way in order to capture their themes and their ideas and what it is that they are trying to convey. And I think The Tempest is a perfect example of poetry that does exactly that. So Shakespeare is indeed an interesting poet and writer because of the way that when you're reading his poetry, the meaning comes first before the words. And I think that that's very fascinating. I like the idea that speech is elevated in Shakespeare. And I want to give an example of his writing in The Tempest by reading the epilogue. So that way you can get an idea for what he's doing in terms of poetry and what it is that he's able to capture. Now, earlier I mentioned Prospero and his character. And this is the epilogue, the closing monologue spoken by Prospero. So definitely pay attention to the language, pay attention to some of the themes and ideas that I've brought up already, and what that does for what Shakespeare is doing. Now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint, now 'tis true, I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver dwell, in this bare island by your spell. But release me from my bands, with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please, now I want, spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults, as you from crimes would pardon be. Let your indulgence set me free. I absolutely love the poetry that is inherent in what Shakespeare is doing, and I think that's a perfect example of him not only having a great narrative arc in his actual drama and story that he's telling, but also capturing the poetry through the way in which he writes. Now, there isn't too much to analyze, because I think that part of the beauty is being able to hear it and imagine it and possibly not overanalyze it. But I think what makes it effective is that he uses these really beautiful rhymes. He uses this wonderful rhythm, I believe 8 syllables per line. And he does this in such a wonderful way, and he captures this emotional acceptance of the character Prospero, which I think is very compelling and apparent in this monologue. And so the reason why I would consider this elevated language and very high poetry is because of the way in which it captures these wonderful universal themes, but doing it in such a way to where it's authentic to Shakespeare himself, and I believe authentic to these characters. And so, yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this episode in my poetry series. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. I hope that you find it interesting for getting you to think about poetry. I definitely hope that you'll check out this play, even if that just means watching the adaptation, which was, I believe, filmed, or at least came out in 2010. But you can find it and watch it. I definitely recommend it. And obviously I recommend reading the play. I think that you'll get a lot out of it, and you'll definitely see what Shakespeare's trying to do. And I definitely hope that you might even have a chance to possibly see the play live, which I think would be amazing. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. That's poetry for you. I hope you enjoy. That's the poetry of Shakespeare. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.